Hello and welcome to this edition of MentorBox. I'm your host, Jonathan Kendall, and today we'll be discussing one of the most important books in the history of Russian, European, and really world literature. The one, the only, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And more importantly, how it teaches us the ultimate meta-secret to all success. Finally answering the age-old question, where should I focus my attention? Of course, though, a lot to unpack here, so let's just get into it straight away, shall we? First off, I know what some of you may be thinking. Why should I have to care about complicated, unfun books like Crime and Punishment? Maybe some of you have already read it, or even if you haven't, you've probably heard that you should read it. It's one of those important books in the canon, they say. But why? What makes a great book great? Or better, what is good art anyway? Nowadays, it may seem like all art is a piece of wood in the middle of the floor in some contemporary art museum, so long as the artist is friends with the curator. Am I right? Well, that is a legitimate sentiment and critique, and it may turn you off from wanting to approach the so-called great books. But I implore you, my friends, you mustn't disparage yourself the opportunity to drink the sweet juice of proper literature. It may not be perfectly easy to read authors like Dostoevsky. It often takes a few hundred pages for the action to really get rolling. But if you stick with it and do the intellectual work necessary to be present with its pages, you will learn to learn lessons from the most unexpected places. You're reading along. A bunch of Russian aristocrats are gossiping, and then bam, you get a line like, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart." And just like that, you're on your back. What does that mean? What is all this around us, this life? Is it good? Bad? What is suffering, and why is it necessary? How do we shield ourselves against it? Or should we at all in the first place? And on the story goes. This touching of the chaotic, this exploration of the unknown, this going there is the plight and glory and beauty and hearteningly bright life of any respectable artist. They put on this planet to feel what we may not so often want to feel on our own. To say to us and for us, I went there on your behalf, to that deep place of solace and darkness and contemplation, and I sat there. I looked around. I observed and I felt like a fire in the palm of the hand, all there is to feel, and meditated on that sensation. And now I've come out, back from those depths, and I'd like to show you what I found. Artists then are explorers of the mind, photographers of the inward unknown, ever attempting to answer the greatest questions of our existence. And for that, we reward them. We thank them for that investigation. Sometimes even we pay them. Because without this deep dive psychology, every pizza ends up tasting the same. Every nice hotel, just a nice hotel. A dinner with the family, another ride around the sun. In a word, without meaning, existence is definitionally meaningless. And so, this imbued import, this is what comes from difficult literature, complicated art, songs of our soul, and the esoteric seeming theories. Because down there, below the surface, there is where we're most definitively alive. Hence, Dostoevsky, an icon. Crime and Punishment, necessary. Art, a compulsory dialogue between humanity and its greater mysteries. Which is why if you dismiss art and literature as unnecessary, you're not only selling yourself short, you're publicly categorizing yourself as a hedonist rather than a thinker. Which begs the question, are you here to discover or to exclusively experience? Oh, I don't really care about great art, you say, casually. To which the world replies, well, then you're not very interesting or really worthy, are you? In short, don't be that person. So you don't really have to worry about all that. In fact, congratulations, I know which side you're on because you are still here, ready for the next. Okay, but let's get specific, okay? First off, let's give a quick backstory of Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist. What makes him unique above the bedlam? Well, it's first important to understand his context. Growing up in a multifaceted, ever-changing Russia, one quickly transitioning from militant Christian orthodoxy to scientific existentialism, nihilism, and atheism, Dostoevsky spent his life straddling those two lines. Growing up hyper-Christian, then spending much of his young adult life with anarchist revolutionaries. He was therefore obsessed with the question, what is the right way to live? Pious or selfish? What is greatness? What is genius? What is right and wrong? And in the case of Crime and Punishment, do the ends ever justify the means, even when murder is involved? After spending some time in a Siberian prison for revolutionary behavior, which he described in this way: in summer, intolerable closeness; in winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten, filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. There was no room to turn around. From dusk to dawn, it was impossible not to behave like pigs. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. But after that, he returned to Western Russia to continue writing. There he completed the now famous Notes from the Underground, Our Present Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov. For a quick reminder, just in case anyone asks, to round out the Dostoevsky lesson, and because I probably won't do any of his other books for a while, Notes from the Underground is basically a rant against the world. The protagonist hates everything and everyone, making everyone unhappy in the meantime. We want happiness, the protagonist says, but we have a special talent for making ourselves miserable. This was Dostoevsky's attack on Russia's social progress, arguing that no matter the changes, there will always be new ways to suffer. The Idiot, another famous work, is basically this. What if Jesus lived today? Someone who likes everything, loves everything. Would such a person survive the onslaught of modern political and social warfare? Dostoevsky argues that most people would think of this person as the idiot, hence the title of the book. The Brothers Karamazov, an argument between brothers about the existence of God. There's more to it, dozens of novels, but that's the basics. As for his style and importance, Dostoevsky's work has been translated into 170 languages. 170. James Joyce said he invented modern prose. He was a favorite of Einstein. Nietzsche called him the only psychologist. Hemingway loved him. Virginia Woolf said he was second only to Shakespeare, Kafka's #1 influence. And here's why. Dostoevsky does not set up straw man arguments. In this way, he was the ultimate intellectual. Instead of dogmatically arguing for one side or the other, he argues as passionately as possible for both sides. Which, by the way, is a meta lesson here. If you believe you are right about something, anything, do not cultishly hide yourself from the opposite viewpoints. Instead, you should always inundate yourself with the most articulate anti-heroes of your team. If you're a staunch social conservative, listen to Sam Harris. Or if you're a bleeding heart liberal, how about a few episodes of Ben Shapiro? In fact, if you can't articulate the best counter-arguments to your beliefs, you really don't know if you're right or wrong, which is really accepted ignorance. And no one wants that. But anyways, Dostoevsky pulls this style off by allowing the most aristocratic of society speak and live next to the worst of society. And the middle too, the smart and the dumb, the rich and the poor. Every part of civilization is given a voice, and a strong one at that. Dostoevsky's style also, by the way, is dramatic. Characters are often crying or yelling at each other. Everyone has obvious ulterior motives. Mysteries, psychologies, and anti-motives abound. The whole book a grand play, which is sort of how Russians are in general, right? Brutally honest, intense. Personally, I like that about them. But this style is also a bit difficult because every character is half brilliant in their articulations. Even the poor, uneducated class are liable to cast off an elaborate soliloquy. So it's often difficult to understand at first glance. And because every character goes so far down so quickly, every conversation seemingly about the meaning of life, the intensity of every conversation can become a bit overwhelming. This is also unrealistic, of course. But Dostoevsky doesn't care about surface level anything. He wants his characters to discuss the nature of being a human immediately and with all the gusto available to them. Compared to our modern clue, mystery, whodunit-centric action movie culture, it feels overwhelming and improbable. But for that very reason, because he's not necessarily trying to entertain us, because he's an allegorical philosopher first, it's hard to get through. But you must read him anyways. Because every so often you'll be trudging along and then it'll hit you. A line or a sentiment, a quote or an explanation, and you'll sit back on your chair and look up towards the heavens and say, wow. Just wow. In fact, with Dostoevsky, it's probably best that we need to stop every so often, because if we don't, we're missing out or not paying attention. But enough with the introduction, let's get into it. Here it is. Crime and Punishment. In a sentence, this book is about a young intellectual who, out of moral superiority, to prove his worth, kills an old woman who he deems unfit for society, only to be tortured by his own guilt for all time. The crime, murder. The punishment, psychological. Instead of a moment of judgment, it is constant. A white noise of culpability, a stain on one's conscience, forever and ever. Amen. This book then, no matter its title, is not a caper, not a precursor to the brilliant mother of mystery, Agatha Christie. Because right off you know the protagonist's intentions, you witness the murder, and you kind of sort of know the whole time that he'll be caught. The novel then is really all about the psychology of moral choice. Again, do the ends ever justify the means? It's about the internal punishment we must endure after committing a wrongdoing, the madness of guilt and shame that we never really ever get away with anything really in the end. To start though, there are a million characters in this book. Dostoevsky is known for this, and they're all incredibly Russian sounding, to be frank, even in the translations. Raskolnikov, Sofia, Donya, Pulcheria, Razmukin, Porfiry Petrovich, Ladisvecha, Alyona Ivonya. Very, very difficult for me to pronounce. I probably messed up most of those. So instead of struggling through, I'm going to refer to these characters as sparingly as possible by their names to save my tongue, favoring understanding over specificity. Hopefully, you forgive me. But nonetheless, let's begin with Raskolnikov, our 20-year-old, hyper-intellectualized, slightly narcissistic, confident student protagonist. He has a theory that is absolutely critical to the entire book, and we learn hints of it right off. He has no money. He hasn't really contributed anything profound to society or his family. He's a student, believes he's smarter than everyone else, which, by the way, I think is pretty common among students. But anyways, he is without a doubt an extreme example of this. He reads difficult books, writes in the local journals, constantly philosophizes about how society should be, and in that obsession has come to a theory, namely that great men do what other great men do not, which I sort of agree with, don't you? Great women, people in general, the successfully elite, the ones who matter, necessarily do what others do not. Wallace D. Wattles says that success is simple. You simply must do what everyone else is unwilling to do. Greatness does not come from average action, etc. The quotes are endless, but in this case, Raskolnikov takes it a bit too far. He compares himself to Napoleon, that Napoleon was above the law. He made the laws rather than bending to them. He made swift decisions. If he had to kill for a greater cause, would he not kill? Of course he would, and did. So, what of great men? Did they not prove their worth by being above the commoners, above common action? And so, Raskolnikov decides that he too will be great. He will prove his superiority by doing what other great people do. He will act above the law and rid the world of its scoundrels. So, we find out that he hates this pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanova. She is cruel, treats her niece like a slave, charges too much, doesn't spend any money, keeps her place in shambles, doesn't contribute to society, is rude, dirty, and rich. Overall, a bit of a wretch. Not good for society, he judges. Maybe I should just get rid of her, he thinks. And most importantly, in his superiority, he thinks he is cold and logical and above it all. Predicts that his control over his mind will ultimately prevail. That he'll get away with it if he does her in. He thinks he deserves the money because he'll do better with it. That killing her, in fact, is not only a test of his rank, but is also a moral act. Dostoevsky writes in this section, "Power is given only to him who dares to stop and take it." One must have the courage to dare. Or in this line, what do you think? Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds? We wonder. And so does he. For the first 100 pages or so, he's planning, psyching himself up, getting ready, getting over the fear, exciting himself at the promise of his coming test, finally committing himself by saying, taking a new step, uttering a new word, is what people fear most. But he will not hesitate like the masses. He will rise above. And so Raskolnikov kills the lady and her visiting pregnant half-sister. Quite brutally, in fact. And gets away with it. But only by chance. And almost immediately thereafter, actually during the event itself a little, he feels instantly guilty about it. This happens often, for example, with cheating. One feels accomplished during the game until one realizes the moment rarely worth the fallout. Anyways, in the bustle and under the guilt, he ends up taking hardly any money, some jewelry and the victim's purse, but none of the great riches he originally wanted. And even what little he collected, he buries in a too public place, difficult to return to and escape with. After, in addition, he goes into a terrible fever for a few days, acting suspiciously while the town bustles with the news of a double homicide. Raskolnikov, again, was trying to prove that he was a great man, like Napoleon, by doing something that a great man would do. And whether this deconstruction into absurdity is legitimate or not is not the point. Because even within his own moral framework, he actually makes himself much worse after committing the murder, proving by his own standards that he is in fact not great at all. He's just a young kid who wanted to skip steps. Rather than becoming great, he wanted to just be great. But life doesn't work that way, does it? So Raskolnikov, wrecked with guilt, ends up for the next few hundred pages aimless in his mind, ever nihilistic and brutal, he says. We're always thinking of eternity as an idea that cannot be understood, something immense. But why must it be? What if instead of all this, you suddenly find just a little room there, something like a village bathhouse, grimy and spiders in every corner. And that's all eternity is. Sometimes, I can't help feeling that that's what it is. This is not a good mental place to be in. The guilt heavy like a knife. In fact, when he sees his friend Sonia's father struck by a carriage and killed, he gives her all of his money. He's literally left with nothing. And by the way, for those of you who haven't read the book, I'm leaving out a few subplots. Yes, the money he refuses from his family, his sister's marriage to a wealthy scoundrel, his mother's sadness and poverty, minor characters here and there. But alas, these are all just further evidence to the greater tragedy, namely that Raskolnikov acted without justification, looking out at the world, attempting to fix it without first fixing himself. And so by this point, because he doesn't have any money, Raskolnikov hasn't paid his rent, so is called into the police office, introducing Petrovich, the detective who believes that Raskolnikov did it, but can't pin it on him quite yet. 100 suspicions don't make a proof, he says. And to compound the troubles of the detective, one of the painters who was in the building during the crime actually confesses to the crime. So without any evidence to pin it on Raskolnikov and a confession from someone else, you think maybe he'll get away with it. But that's Dostoevsky's brilliance, because it doesn't really matter whether he legally gets away with it. He's already lost. In his head, a greater punishment forever taking place. Though, to finish, later in contemplating whether to confess, he asks himself, do you understand? Do you understand what it means when you have absolutely nowhere to turn? For every man must have somewhere to turn, right? In the end, Raskolnikov does think that he can get away with the murder, but Sonia, his friend, convinces him to turn himself in anyways. He's sentenced to 8 years in Siberia, where eventually he, like a good Christian, forgives himself and lives with Sonia until the end. He finishes, I used to analyze myself down to the last thread, used to compare myself with others, recalled all the smallest glances, smiles, and words of those to whom I tried to be frank, interpreted everything in a bad light, laughed viciously at my attempts to be like the rest. And suddenly, in the midst of my laughing, I'd give way to sadness, fall into ludicrous despondency, and once again start the whole process all over again. In short, I went round and round like a squirrel on a wheel. And then finally, truly great men must, I think, therefore experience great sorrow on the earth. And so there you have it. Crime and its psychological punishment. Though, what's the point? Well, Raskolnikov is a young, smart, good-looking person. We actually like him. We actually understand him and can relate to him throughout the book in a strange way. He's a monster, but we don't feel like he's a monster. Because, well, don't we all sort of feel superior most of the time? Or more accurately, don't we often think that we are accomplishing less than we deserve? That the rich haven't earned their place, except of course that the poor, they're guilty of sloth as well, that the government, corrupt, bureaucracy, inefficient, capitalism, greedy, socialism, a nanny state, education, a conspiracy to keep us down, everyone over there, and especially they over there. If only they understood us. If only they did what I knew what was right. Wouldn't the world just be better off? If only everyone knew how great I am. If only the world was fair. This is what I like to call unearned moral superiority. A student, a young person, an adult, all of us, we who can't keep a job, we who can't get a promotion, we who can't start a company, we who can't scale our company fast enough, we who can't lead a small team, we who can't show up on time, we who can't fight hedonistic urges, we who can't keep our house in order, we who can't make our beds, who can't keep our cool, be kind to our family, be respectful of ourselves and others, we who can't write a coherent theory, we who can't acknowledge the complexity of the forest we so desire to tear down, we are the ones with all the answers? No. Complaint is not wisdom. Theory is not action. Because let me be clear here. If you cannot take care of your own life to a world-class level, if you are not an expert at some specific skill, if you are not in charge of a few, yourself, dozens, hundreds, thousands of lives, if you have not practiced the moral slicing of complex issues in the real world, if you have not been given by way of a legitimate earning a place at society's moral court, if you have not accomplished what humanity deems worthy of its respect, then your opinions are most often opinions. Because if you want to change the world, then actually change it. Do not point and judge. Do not kill old women because you would have done better with their money. No. If you want to fight poverty, then get elected and write the law. If you want to complain about healthcare, then make sure you yourself are first healthy. Because if you cannot take care of the 3 feet which surrounds you, then you have not earned the respect necessary to join the club of those who have. Moral? If Raskolnikov wanted to prove himself great, then he should have done great things. He should have been a great person. He should have grown into a great leader, step by step. The rest, the skipping of steps, is both cowardice and ego. Nietzsche says it this way: all cowardice masquerades as morality. Everyone's perfect, as they say, from the cheap seats. So here's the lesson. Before you judge others, clean your own house. First, take care of your own mat, lest you get yourself into trouble before you're ready for its consequences. Do something important before you judge others. Or as Dostoevsky's contemporary Tolstoy once wrote, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. Which brings us full circle. To begin, I promise to give you the ultimate meta lesson of success, to answer the most important question of our lives. Where should I focus my attention? And the answer, for Raskolnikov, for me, for you, for all of us, is within. You take care of you. I take care of me. And together, when we are powerful enough to come back out, when we are humble enough to understand the smallness that belies our greatness, when we revel in the density of our collective psychologies, when we learn to forgive, to focus on learning rather than judging, when we bring about solutions instead of complaints, when we add to the energy rather than take away, when we can be relied upon rather than taken care of, when we are leaders rather than followers, when we are worthy of our seat at the philosophical table rather than demand it out of some self-crowned entitlement, then, and only then, will we progress. So, do not be like Raskolnikov. Do not skip steps. Prove your greatness every single day. Happy learning, my friends. Until next time, cheers.